I'm Charlotte McLeod with the Investing News Network, and here today with me is Peter Krauth, editor of Silver Stock Investor and author of The Great Silver Bull. Thank you so much for being here today. Great to see you.
My pleasure, Charlotte.
Really nice to be seeing you, and we did check in just about a month ago, but there's so much to talk about in silver. So one of the things that we spoke about in our VRAC conversation was some of the latest statistics from the Silver Institute. And of course, right after we did that interview, there were some revisions.
Exactly.
And I think one of the really big ones was the deficit. So it increased very significantly, 253 million ounces. So can you put that into some historical context for us?
Well, you only have to look back about the 2 previous years. In 2020, there was a surplus of 69 million ounces. And so, as you said, the original forecast was for a deficit in 2022 of 193 million ounces, I believe. And that was revised to 253. So if you look at the swing over those 2 years, it was actually a 322 million ounce swing. And so that is absolutely record deficits. And the interesting thing is that the Silver Institute, amongst others, believe that these are going to persist for years going forward.
Right, and let's talk about the next year deficit projection. It's high. I think it's 119 million ounces, lower than 253, but still very big. So is this going to be the new reality in the silver market?
I think so, and I think that that's actually probably a lowball estimate in my view. Some of the things, the main driver probably, unless we have some kind of wild card on the investment side, but I think the main driver is going to be the solar industry, which consumes 12% per year. And I saw some estimates recently from the International Energy Agency that says that in the next 5 years, they expect global PV installations to triple. So, by my calculations right now, if the solar industry alone takes 12% of the annual supply of silver, and that triples, so we're looking at 36% of the annual supply of silver, and we're seeing mine supply actually fall. The only thing that could help balance that somewhat is if you have investment demand fall off, which I certainly don't expect, or recycling to come back, which represents about 15 to 20% every year of the supply. Now, recycling could come back in a bigger way if prices rise significantly, because a lot of this silverware and that kind of thing will come out of people's closets and buffets. But that's certainly not something I would count on. And we haven't even accounted for the fact that silver is important in things like EVs and electronics and in medicine, and all of these applications they keep finding new applications for silver because of its properties. So I certainly don't see that slowing down, and I do think we're headed for, it may not be quite so large deficits for the next several years, but it's going to be multi-decade high deficits, I think, persistent.
So solar demand important, other industrial applications also important. We had a reader write in with a question about Indian silver imports in 2022, and wondered if you could speak about that, because those are also quite large.
Yeah, so I did see those numbers actually go by. I don't remember them offhand, but I do remember that it was an outsized import quantity. Indians are very shrewd when it comes to precious metals, buying and selling them. They have a multi-thousand-year history of investing and holding on to precious metals because their currency gets debased so regularly, and they're big silverware and silver jewelry buyers. I've read about how silver has become a big thing in jewelry in India and elsewhere as well, but India in particular. So yes, again, as I say, they're shrewd buyers, and when they saw the price weak last year, they took advantage of it. And so we had some weakness a couple of times. I'm going to say sort of late spring, and then again in the fall when it backed down to about $18.50 or even $17.50, $18. And in my bet, if you had to look on a month-by-month basis, that's probably when a lot of that accumulation took place.
I think we hear this a lot, when it comes to the East versus the West.
Yes.
When precious metals, they're maybe a little bit more savvy than we are over here.
Exactly.
Okay, so I think we need to address kind of the elephant in the room for silver, which is if we have this massive deficit last year, further projected deficits into the future, what is going on with the price? And I think that from talking to you, from talking to other people, I'm starting to realize that things really need to align perfectly for silver. It needs the industrial, the investment, including ETF and physical. So are we just waiting for that correct alignment?
Yeah, so if you look at how the price has behaved, especially even very, very recently, so the last month when we last spoke, I think silver was close to $24. Right now we're close to $21. And I don't feel that you have to look very far to explain that. Look at what happened in the dollar. The dollar had a rally. Silver is an asset like any other. It competes with other assets. The 1 year U.S. Treasury is now yielding 5%. And if you look at the chart of that, that really had a very rapid run up. That's because the market started to see, because of inflation remaining relatively high, the Fed started to change its tune and manage expectations that they were going to continue hiking for longer than the market originally expected. So the dollar rallied, the yields rallied in, as I say, the 1 year. So the 1 year is paying 5%. And if you look at inflation expectations, so these things, you have surveys for this, and the 1 year inflation expectation by consumers is 5%. So that matches up exactly with the 1 year U.S. Treasury. And when you think that the Fed wants us to, or is hoping that we're going to believe that inflation is coming back down to 2%, and yet consumers believe that a year out from now we're still going to be at 5%. So that's a really big gap, and I think that what you're seeing is, it's funny, recent retail numbers in the U.S. showed were well beyond what was expected. And I think that actually I write about this in my book, something called inflationary psychology. And that's when people at first don't really accept that inflation is here to stay quite the way it could be. And then they start to come around to it, absorb it, and then it sinks in, they finally believe it. And then they say, oh, well, you know what, based on what I keep hearing in the news, yes, inflation is still strong. Maybe I shouldn't put off that purchase that I had in mind to wait for because I've been thinking prices were going to come back down. So they start making these purchases, sometimes larger purchases. And to me, that at least helps somewhat explain these higher retail sales. So it's like they're starting to want to get ahead of these ongoing price increases, and that could actually lead to a bit of a vicious cycle because that could help foster even more inflation because of the renewed demand for goods. And so it could be a vicious cycle, and I think that at least, I mean, it's a long-winded answer, but all of these things come into play: stronger yields in the 1 year Treasury, a stronger dollar. Those are sort of the most simple short-term explanations for a pullback in silver.
No, and the long explanation is totally fine. I hadn't heard it explained that way, so that was interesting for me to hear. So you told us before, just a month ago, you don't really expect a big move in silver in the first half of the year.
Right.
Second half of the year, maybe a different story as we see different things going on with the Fed. So is that still, I mean, it's only been a month, so I'm sure that it's probably the same, but.
It is. In fact, I've tempered it a little bit. I think that this weakness could go on a little bit longer, even perhaps into the very early part of the second half of the year. But I do see higher prices, especially in the second half and the latter part of the second half. I think that we just said that I just said that the market's seeing the Fed hawkish for a little bit longer, potentially, and so that strength. I don't think that we're going to see the dollar remain as strong as it is for that much longer. So it's having a counter trend rally right now. It made it down to I think it was about 100, 102. The dollar index. We're up at about 104, 105 right now. I think it would go to 106, maybe even 107. I think that it would top around there, and that could top earlier than yields perhaps on their treasuries. And that could be the first kind of headwind that we have for silver. So that would certainly help silver move. I know that there's about a negative 80% correlation between the US dollar and the silver price over the last 22, 23 years. So if anybody's looking for what might happen with silver, your first indication is what's likely to happen with the dollar.
All right. I have a little bit of a broad question about silver because, we always think about it in tandem with gold. But gold is close to its all-time high. It's at kind of a much more elevated level compared to silver, which is quite far. So how have we had gold establish that kind of higher base while silver remains lower?
Right. So I think that, and we've seen that, as you say, we've seen that also time and time again. Gold runs first, silver follows, and then eventually outpaces and outperforms gold in a bull market. And I think that gold has done its job. It's anticipated the inflation that we've had. That's why we had that run up in 2020. It's been moving sideways, and especially been holding off. You could kind of say since the Fed has started to become that much more aggressive with its rate hikes last year. But it's done its job. It was flat last year. Silver was actually up a little bit, but silver has become more of an industrial metal. There's no question it retains its monetary properties, but it's become a bit of an industrial metal. And I think if you look at how the Fed has been so hawkish, rates have risen, the market has pulled back, and I think that the market is saying to itself, and despite the fundamentals probably indicating other things, but the market's looking at that and saying, is silver going to necessarily be that strong because of its industrial properties? Will demand on the industrial side continue as much as it has? And I think that's kind of what's getting factored in. And I think it's a mistake actually to think that it won't, because if and when, or I should say more like when you have slowdowns economically, we saw that with most recently with the COVID pandemic. Governments come in and stimulate, and if and when we have a recession, it's likely that we'll see on the fiscal side. So governments will start to stimulate potentially again, especially if there's some kind of a big sell-off in markets and some kind of an economic or financial crisis. So they'll still stimulate again. There's no question that green transition and infrastructure are very, very let's say acceptable and popular areas to be stimulating and arguably affect and help everyone in some way because we use infrastructure and so on, that silver will be a big beneficiary of that. And so I think it's unwise to underestimate the likely ongoing demand for silver in that kind of scenario. Very
interesting. So in the past, you've done a really good job of explaining to us all the different options that people can look at when it comes to getting exposure to silver. Today, I want to talk specifically about the juniors and just find out, are there any considerations that you really would want people to keep in mind when they're looking at the silver juniors?
Sure. So, I have a few filters when I decide to ultimately write up a silver junior, and one of them is jurisdiction, and I think that's becoming more important than ever. You see all kinds of challenges in places that you didn't see before. If you look back maybe 30 years or so ago, you just went where the silver was, and it really wasn't an issue. Today, that's very different, especially because a lot of, and rightly so, but a lot of governments are cracking down on the environmental side and insisting that these operations be run in an environmentally sound and sustainable way, and so. And then you have resource nationalization, which some governments, have no issues about. Others do. Others have learned and have become wiser. And I think that that is absolutely one of the biggest things that investors need to look at first when it comes to making a choice if they're going to give their dollars to one of these companies.
Definitely really important. And so we're at PDAC. There's all kinds of companies down there on the floor out there moving forward. Are there any that you are watching for catalysts for at this moment in 2023?
I would say that there are a few that I do recommend. One that actually has been outstanding very recently called Hercules Silver. It's up about 50% in the last month or so, and they have a project in Idaho, which western Idaho, which they just started drilling, and the first results have come out, and they've done all kinds of I'm going to say advanced geophysics, these kinds of things, and they really see that they have a big potential for quite a sizable project, and they're really intercepting very high grades, which is important. The high grades are not necessarily that deep, which is also important, and it looks like they can expand this tremendously. So again, Idaho's ranked way up there in terms of jurisdiction, which is an important factor. And so, yeah, I'm keeping a close eye on them. A couple of other companies that I like that are developing pretty well. You've got Suma Silver. It's doing a tremendous job in New Mexico and in Nevada. You've got Silver Hammer that has taken on a new president, and I think we're going to see some great activity from them. And there's Dolly Varden that has been a standout, has performed really well over the past year, and I think will continue to do so. They really have something special, I think, in the Golden Triangle. So these are names that I would suggest that investors keep an eye on.
Okay, thank you for sharing that, because I think it's always helpful to see the criteria that you look for and then find some examples. As we are wrapping up, I have another reader question that I wanted to bring to you. It's a question about using silver in a retirement account, and basically, how does this work? Why don't we hear more about this? Why doesn't the mining industry educate people as to this option?
So I'm going to have to make some assumptions that they mean somehow hold physical silver. Or how do you know how specific the question is? It doesn't say.
This is the question.
Right, okay. So, I mean, you do have options. You have ETFs, which is probably the most simple way. Now, I know that there are some services that allow you to hold somehow physical silver in a retirement account. I know for sure that in the US these options exist. It's not something that I'm that familiar with. In Canada, I do believe that, I would recommend that this person do some research in terms of seeing what options there are, what services will allow you to actually hold physical silver in a retirement account, if that's really what their goal is. If not, there are, as I say, ETFs that hold physical silver. They're not all the same. If I had to make a choice, my preferred option is the Sprott Physical Silver ETF in terms of its construction. The silver is held at the Royal Canadian Mint, so if this is a Canadian investor, that would be my preferred option.
Okay, I think that's very helpful. And once again, it kind of comes back to that idea of you've got to do your own research. You have to figure out what is best
Absolutely.
for you. So that's everything from me today, unless you had any final thoughts on silver that you want to add.
Yeah, I would say that don't let this recent pullback scare you. I think that the fundamentals are as strong and improving, as strong as ever, and improving constantly for the silver market. So, and at least my base case is that when it comes to inflation, we might continue to see overall inflation pull back somewhat. Longer term, I don't see that being the case. I think this entire decade is going to see elevated levels of inflation. I think that 4% inflation is going to be the new 2%. You know, we lived for decades with 2%, but I simply don't see us going back anywhere close to that level anymore. 4% is what we're going to probably have, even a range, 4% to 5%. If we can get there, I honestly think that central banks are probably going to be, at least secretly, quite happy with that, and have to expect or have to manage consumers' expectations that that's going to be the new reality.
All right, well, not the most happy place to wrap up, but we'll leave it there, and I think it does make a strong case for silver as well as gold. So thank you so much for coming by to talk about what's going on in the market. It's always good to hear
Always
from you.
my pleasure, Charlotte. Thank you.
Amazing. And once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with the Investing News Network, and this is Peter Krauth.